Welcome to our Faces of Autism interview featuring Dr. Janet Mclaughlin. So Dr. Mclaughlin is an associate professor of health studies and co-founder and co-director of the Laurier Autism Research Consortium at Wilfrid Laurier University. After her son was diagnosed with autism in 2012, she developed an interest in the needs and experiences of caregivers, including the impacts of services on their well-being. So along with Dr. Schneider, she has since led two major province-wide surveys of autism family caregivers and is now conducting interviews with Indigenous and newcomer families to understand the additional challenges that they face. So after strongly advocating for reform in the wake of provincial funding changes, in 2019, Dr. Mclaughlin served on the Ontario Autism Advisory Panel to provide recommendations to reshape the Ontario Autism Program. So we've invited Dr. Mclaughlin today to interview with us and to share her insights on some of the questions that we have planned. So let's get started. So our first question for Dr. Mclaughlin is, how has your experience as a parent of an autistic child impacted your work?
Well, it is the reason I began researching autism in the first place. Prior to having my son diagnosed with autism, my academic focus was in an entirely different area. I was researching health inequities experienced by migrant workers. So a very, very different change in focus there. But once I realized that I was parenting on an autistic child, my focus in all areas of my life shifted considerably, just to try to learn everything I could about autism. And I also got really involved in autism advocacy once I realized just how inadequate services were for children like mine. So because I was so personally passionate about the topic, it only made sense to also pursue it as an academic focus. And that's one of the best parts of this job, is we really get to research whatever we're interested in. And it's a real privilege to be able to do that. So I guess I was really fighting alongside other families at the time when this all happened. My son had been waiting for years for entry into services. And then the government of the time decided that children over the age of 5 wouldn't be eligible for supports anymore. And so just being at that time, my son was turning 5 and we had been waiting for 3 years already. So I got involved in protesting this policy change, and that's where I met many other families for the first time who had children diagnosed with autism and who were on the front lines trying to fight this change. And that's when I realized just how many families across the province were struggling with inadequate supports, with long wait times, with these sudden policy changes that upended their lives. And so I decided I wanted my research to explore this in more depth and ultimately shine a light on this issue for the public and for policymakers. I also realized that as much as my family was struggling, we were coming from a place of privilege. My husband's a family doctor. We were able to identify the signs of autism really early. We were able to get the earliest possible diagnosis, paying out of pocket. We were able to pay for therapies and supports privately as much as we could. And so I was really concerned with how families from different social backgrounds would be faring, knowing that most of them would not be able to afford these things, and really feeling like this is a two-tier system, and that where people can essentially jump the queue if they're able to pay for it. And I really felt like that was socially unjust. So that's a little bit about the background of why I got interested in this topic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing. Your current research is about exploring compounded challenges facing underserved populations, and particularly newcomer and Indigenous communities. Could you tell us a bit about your research and some of the additional challenges that these families face?
Sure. So just to contextualize that research, after getting interested in these issues, I led 2 province-wide surveys just of the general Ontario population, anyone who wanted to answer. And I did this alongside my colleague, Dr. Margaret Schneider, also at Laurier. So we published our first report in 2019 and our second report last year in 2022, which also looked at experiences during the pandemic. So both of these reports revealed that autistic children and their families, not surprisingly, are waiting on these very long wait lists, first for diagnosis and then for therapies and supports. And this can be really, really stressful for both children and their caregivers. We also found that many autistic children are not receiving adequate supports at school or in the community, leading to social exclusion and in some cases school exclusions too. Now, since I have that background in health inequities and underserved populations, I was curious to know how these challenges would be impacted by caregivers from different populations, in particular newcomers and Indigenous families. And these were also the two groups we identified as not participating fully as other populations were in our survey. So we felt like since they were underrepresented in the research and they likely face compounded barriers, it would be really important to look at their experiences. So just the caveat, like we're really at the early stage of this research right now, so any kind of findings would be preliminary. So far, we've conducted 19 interviews with newcomer and Indigenous peoples, and we are now doing a much larger project where we're interviewing many more. But just some preliminary findings. First, not surprisingly, we found that newcomer and Indigenous families are experiencing all the same stresses as the general population, with these very long wait lists and the stresses that brings about. But then we also found that some of the compounded issues they were experiencing included things like racism and discrimination in the system. For Indigenous peoples, especially those living on reserve and rural and remote areas, the geography posed huge barriers. Like these autism diagnosis and other services are very specialized. And so in some cases, there were no service providers available in these communities, and it made it very difficult to get their children access to services. And then for newcomers, we found that language barriers, as well as a lack of family supports, because they'd often left their entire support system back in their countries of origin, were compounded barriers among many others. We are actually just about to publish a paper on our preliminary findings, and I'd be happy to send it to you if people are interested in learning more about those.
Yeah, absolutely. And another question we have for you is, what supports do parents of autistic children have, and what supports could be improved?
Great question. So the main program supporting autistic children up to the age of 18, which contains several streams of funding, is called the Ontario Autism Program. So the most notable stream of funding, the one that most families are waiting for, is called core services, and that includes basically the different forms of therapy that are often accessed for children. This includes speech language pathology, occupational therapy, behavioral therapy, and mental health therapies. And so the problem is that the wait list for these services has grown to around 60,000 children, and families are now basically being told they don't know when they'll ever get access to these services. And families entering them now have been already waiting 5 or 6 years. So newly diagnosed children and youth are going out without adequate supports, and those diagnosed later are often aging out of this program before they can even access it. So obviously the big improvement there would be increasing funding, decreasing wait times, and ensuring that everyone can access services in a timely manner. And then the other program that some families have access to is called Special Services at Home. This provides things like respite, but again, the wait lists are long and funding amounts are inadequate. So really the government needs to invest more in these programs to ensure that families are well supported. Another thing that our research has identified is that because services are so inadequate for children, and that includes school as well as out of school services, parents are often picking up the pieces when their children are basically told they can't attend school because there's not support, or sent home early due to a behavioral matter, and then there's not support to manage that, or because there's a lack of funding for therapy and respite. Parents, especially mothers, are often giving up their jobs or downgrading their careers, working part-time or flexible jobs in order to provide those supports for their children and fill in the gaps that the services are not providing. And so we found that there's a real gender inequity issue there, with mainly women being affected by this. So another policy I would like to see is improved employment supports for caregivers to ensure that they do not have to give up careers in order to make up for these service inadequacies, generally in the province.
Thank you. And finally, as a researcher, advocate, and parent of an autistic child, what do you think needs to be better understood about autism?
Great question. I think the diversity of the spectrum needs to be better understood and appreciated. For many people without a personal connection to autism, they may just be going on what they're seeing in the media. And so in these portrayals, we often see independent autistic adults who may be a bit quirky, who've attained postgraduate education, and they communicate fluently through speaking. So I am really encouraged to see autism represented in the media, but people like my son, who are largely non-speaking, or those who have very high support needs, are almost never depicted. And as a result, their needs and the needs of their caregivers who are supporting their autistic loved ones throughout their entire lives are rendered largely invisible. So that's really problematic to me. Really, I think we can all agree all people on the autism spectrum deserve the supports they need to live their best lives, whether that be sensory accommodations or a diverse range of therapies or counseling, or as they age, post-secondary education supports, inclusive housing, job programs, recreation programs, whatever. In order to provide those different supports, we need to understand the diversity of needs that exist. And we really need to appreciate the huge scope of interests and needs that autistic people have across their lifespan. So I'd just like to ensure going forward in policy development that all autistic people are consulted and considered when we're thinking about policy development and how to support everyone, regardless of where they fall on the spectrum and where their diverse needs and interests might lie.
Thank you, Dr. Mclaughlin, and thank you for joining us today in the Faces of Autism interview, and we'll hope to see you next time.
Thanks so much for having me, and
Thank you.
all the best.
Thank you.